She was 22 years old and 3 semesters away from a degree she had chosen carefully, planned for methodically, and stopped believing in somewhere around the middle of her sophomore year without telling anyone. She was studying corporate law, not because she had woken up one morning passionate about corporate law, but because her academic advisor had told her it was stable, her mother had told her it was respectable, and the starting salaries her classmates talked about in the library had sounded, at 20 years old, like the solution to every problem she could imagine having. She was good at it. That was the hardest part to explain later. She wasn't failing. She wasn't struggling. She was pulling a 3.7 GPA in one of the most competitive programs at the university, and feeling, beneath all of it, the specific hollowness of someone who is very good at something that means nothing to them. She had not told her father any of this. Her father was the kind of man who didn't need to be told things. He noticed. He had been noticing her his entire life with the particular attention of a man who had raised a daughter alone since she was 9 years old, and who understood that the most important things were usually the ones people didn't say out loud. He called her every Sunday at 7 in the evening. The calls lasted exactly as long as they needed to. He asked about her week without asking about her grades. He told her about the restaurant, what had come in fresh that week, what he had tried on the specials menu which regulars had asked about her. He made her laugh at least once per call without trying to. She did not know during any of those Sunday calls that he was sick. He had known for 8 months. He had told no one. The call came on a Wednesday morning in November, from a hospital 200 miles away. She drove through the night and arrived at 6 in the morning and sat beside his bed for 4 days, and on the 5th day he was gone. He was 58 years old. She stayed for the funeral and the week after, moving through the practical requirements of grief, the arrangements, the paperwork, the neighbors who came with food she couldn't eat. She stayed in the house she had grown up in, sleeping in her childhood bedroom, waking at 3 in the morning to the specific silence of a house that used to have someone else in it. She would lie awake listening to that silence and think about Sunday phone calls, about the way he said her name when she answered. Not as a greeting exactly, more as a confirmation, the way you confirm something you already knew. She thought about the last call, 3 weeks before the hospital called, in which he had seemed perfectly himself, unhurried, funny, asking about a professor she had mentioned the week before and remembering details she had forgotten she had shared. He had known then. He had been sick then. He had spent that call being completely her father without letting any of it through, which she understood, once the grief had settled enough to allow understanding, was the most him thing he could have done. 3 weeks after the funeral, she met with the attorney who handled his affairs. She went expecting to sign documents. She went expecting the meeting to be brief and administrative, and to leave her with a clear list of things to do before returning to school to finish what she had started. What she left with was a set of keys and a document that transferred to her sole ownership of a property at 14 Maple Street, the building that had housed her father's restaurant for 21 years. There was a letter with it, written in his handwriting, which she recognized immediately and which made the room go briefly sideways. She did not read it in the attorney's office. She drove to Maple Street and sat in the car in front of the restaurant and read it there. The restaurant was called Sal's. It had always been called Sal's, which was not her father's name. His name was Daniel, but which had been the name of the man who had owned the building before him and who had sold it to Daniel for a price below market value because, as Sal had told him at the time, he reminded him of someone he used to be. Daniel had kept the name because he said it was already on the sign and signs were expensive, but she had always suspected the real reason was that he liked the continuity. He liked the idea of a place that had been a place for a long time. He had opened it when she was 1 year old, 2 years after her mother left, in a building that had been a diner before Sal bought it and a hardware store before that. He had done most of the renovation himself, slowly, over the first 2 years, working nights after service and weekends, learning as he went with the specific stubbornness of a man who could not afford to hire what he could teach himself. She knew all of this the way you know the stories that have been told your whole life, abstractly, without texture. She had grown up in the restaurant the way children grow up in the places their parents work, doing homework at the corner table, washing dishes on weekends for pocket money, eating family meal with the kitchen staff on Friday nights. She knew the restaurant the way she knew her own hands, so familiar it had become invisible. She had not been inside since before she left for college. She sat in the car on Maple Street and read her father's letter. "I know this is not what you planned," he wrote. "I know you have a plan. You have always had a plan. You got that from me, except that my plans were always about food and yours were always about everything except food, which I found funny but never said so. I am leaving you the restaurant because I don't know who else would understand it. I am not leaving it to you because I think you should run it. I am leaving it to you because I trust you to know what it's worth. Not in money, in the other way. There are things in this building I never showed you. Things I was going to show you when the time was right, and then the time kept not being right, and now I am running out of time in the most literal sense, which I am trying to approach with humor and mostly succeeding. Start in the kitchen. Look at the wall behind the large prep counter, the one I paneled over in 1998 when the health inspector said the old plaster was a liability. I always meant to go back to that wall. I never did. I think you should. The restaurant is closed. The staff have been paid through the end of the month. The lease is paid through June. What happens after June is up to you. I love you more than I have ever been able to say correctly. That is the one thing I would do differently. Dad. She sat in the car for a long time after she finished reading. The street outside was ordinary. A Tuesday afternoon in November, a woman walking a dog, a delivery truck double-parked 2 doors down, the specific, unremarkable texture of a day that has no idea it is the day everything changes. Then she got out, walked to the front door of Sal's and used the key. The restaurant smelled like him. That was the first thing. Before she saw anything, before she took in the covered tables and the chairs stacked on top of them and the bar with its bottles still lined up behind it, before any of it registered visually, the smell reached her, and for a moment the grief that she had been managing carefully for 3 weeks became unmanageable, and she stood in the doorway and let it be unmanageable for a few minutes because there was no one there to see, and because it needed to be. The smell was specific. Not food exactly, though food was part of it. Old wood and olive oil and the particular warmth that kitchens hold in their walls after years of heat. She had smelled it 10,000 times growing up, and it had meant nothing beyond ordinary because ordinary things mean nothing until they are gone, and then they mean everything. She stood in the doorway until she could breathe normally. Then she walked through to the kitchen. It was a professional kitchen, small by restaurant standards but efficient. Her father had designed the workflow himself, and anyone who had ever worked in it said it was the most logical kitchen they had ever used. Every station exactly where it needed to be. Everything within reach of everything else. The kind of kitchen that reflected a person who had thought carefully about how work should move through a space. The large prep counter ran along the back wall. Above it, her father had installed wood paneling in 1998. She remembered it vaguely, remembered him working on it on a Sunday, remembered asking why and him saying something about the health inspector that she hadn't really listened to because she was 12 and had other concerns. She looked at the paneling now. Plain, tongue and groove pine, painted white, installed carefully but without particular artistry. She ran her hand along the surface. In one section it sounded different. Not hollow exactly, but lighter, less solid. She pressed and felt a slight give. She found a pry bar in the utility closet where her father had always kept his tools, organized with the same logic as the kitchen, everything in its place. She worked the first board loose carefully, not wanting to damage what might be behind it. Behind the paneling was the original plaster wall, and on the plaster wall were paintings. She stepped back. They covered the entire wall, floor to ceiling, the full length of the prep counter, murals painted directly onto the plaster in colors that had faded but not disappeared, protected for 26 years behind the pine paneling. Scenes of a kitchen. Not this kitchen specifically, but a kitchen from another era. Women in aprons working at long wooden tables, men carrying crates through a back door, children sitting on a counter eating something from a bowl, a table laden with food, a window with a garden visible through it, and throughout, woven into the scenes like a visual refrain, a particular flower painted with a precision that suggested whoever had done it had painted from life. At the bottom right corner, small and easy to miss, a signature and a date. The signature was a name she didn't know. The date was 1931. She stood in the kitchen of her father's restaurant looking at paintings that had been there since 1931, that had survived the hardware store and Sal's diner and her father's renovation and 21 years of service and everything else, waiting behind $8 worth of pine paneling for someone to take it down. She sat on the kitchen floor for a long time. She thought about her father standing in this exact spot in 1998, health inspector's citation in hand, looking at these paintings and making a decision. Not to destroy them, not to report them, not to make them someone else's problem, but to cover them carefully and leave them for later, for the right moment, for whoever would know what to do. He had known even then that later might not be him. She called Reuben, her father's oldest friend, a man who had eaten at Sal's every Thursday for 20 years, and who knew more about the history of that building and that street than anyone living. Reuben came within the hour. He stood in the kitchen and looked at the wall without speaking for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was careful, the way voices get when something large is trying to be contained in ordinary words. "I heard about these," he said slowly. "My father mentioned them once. He worked in this building in the 60s, before Sal bought it. He said the owner back then told him there were paintings under the walls that the previous owner had covered because he thought they were old-fashioned." He paused. Nobody knew they were still there. Who painted them? Reuben looked at the signature in the corner. "I don't know that name, but I know someone who might." The someone was a woman at the County Historical Society named Dr. Ferrara, who arrived the next morning with a younger colleague and 2 large flashlights and spent 4 hours in the kitchen examining the wall with an attention that reminded her of the way her father had examined produce at the market. Complete, unhurried, professionally intimate. Dr. Ferrara told her that the paintings were the work of a muralist who had been part of a federal arts program in the 1930s, one of hundreds of artists employed across the country to create work in public and commercial buildings during the Depression. Most of that work had been documented. Some had been lost. A significant portion had been covered over by subsequent owners who considered it dated or inconvenient. "Finding one intact is not common," Dr. Ferrara said. "Finding one in this condition, protected by accident for nearly a century, is extraordinary." She asked what it meant practically. Dr. Ferrara looked at her carefully, the way people look when they are deciding how much to say. "It means this wall cannot be touched without a preservation review. It means there are state and federal grant programs specifically for situations like this. It means the building has a historical significance it didn't have officially yesterday." She paused. "It also means you have a decision to make about what this place is going to be." She did not go back to school that semester. She told herself she would defer and return in the fall, which she believed when she said it and continued to believe for approximately 6 weeks, at which point she had begun the preservation process with Dr. Ferrara's office, applied for 2 restoration grants, hired a structural engineer named Barros to assess the building's overall condition, and started cooking in her father's kitchen every morning to keep herself grounded while everything else was uncertain. Barros was a small, serious man in his 50s who moved through buildings the way doctors move through patients, with systematic attention, touching walls and pressing floors and looking at ceilings with an expression that gave nothing away until he was ready to give it. He spent 2 full days in the building, and on the morning of the 3rd day sat across from her at the corner table in the empty dining room and laid out what he had found. The bones were good. The foundation was original to 1908 and solid. The load-bearing walls were sound. The roof needed replacing within 2 years but was not urgent. The electrical was a serious problem. Her father had updated it in sections over the years, but the panel was undersized for a commercial kitchen, and several circuits were running at capacity. The plumbing was adequate, but old. He gave her numbers. Real numbers. Not rounded, not softened. The full restoration to a functioning restaurant kitchen would cost more than she had. Not dramatically more, but more. She looked at the numbers for a long time. "The mural changes things," Barrows said. It was the first time he had mentioned it. "I've worked on 3 historic preservation projects in this county. The grant funding is real. The timeline is slow, but the money comes through." He looked at her. "You'd need to be patient." "How patient?" 8 months to a year before you're operational. Maybe more if the preservation review is complicated." She thought about the lease paid through June. She thought about her savings, which were modest, built from part-time work during school and summers waitressing at a restaurant that was not her father's. She thought about the attorney's office and the set of keys and the letter in her father's handwriting that she had read 6 times since that first afternoon in the car. "Okay," she said. Barrows looked at her with something that might have been respect. "You should know," he said, "that most people in your situation sell." "I know," she said. The months that followed were the hardest and the most clarifying of her life. She moved out of the house she had grown up in. She couldn't afford to keep it without her father's income. And moved into the small apartment above the restaurant that had been used for storage as long as she could remember. She spent 2 days clearing it out, finding in the process the accumulated artifacts of 21 years of running a restaurant. Old menus in a cardboard box, a collection of handwritten recipes on index cards in her father's precise script, a framed photograph of the staff from 2008 that she recognized herself in, age 10, standing at the edge of the frame in a too large apron, pretending to be helpful. She hung the photograph on the wall of the apartment. She learned the preservation process the way she had learned corporate law, methodically, completely, without a particular joy, but with the understanding that mastery was the only way through. She attended every meeting with the Historical Society. She read every document Dr. Ferrara sent her. She learned the specific vocabulary of historic preservation, what qualified as original fabric, what constituted an irreversible alteration, what the difference was between restoration and rehabilitation, and why it mattered to the grant committees. She also cooked every day. Not for service, the restaurant wasn't open. For herself, and increasingly for the people who appeared in the way people appear around a project that has a visible human being at the center of it. Reuben came twice a week and ate whatever she made and gave opinions that were honest without being unkind. Barrows stopped by on Fridays to check progress, and she always fed him. A woman from 2 doors down named Celestine, who ran an alterations shop and had been her father's neighbor for 15 years, began appearing on Tuesday mornings with coffee and staying for an hour, talking about the street, about the building, about what the neighborhood had been like when her father had first opened. Celestine remembered the day Sal's opened. She had been 26. She said Daniel had put a handwritten sign in the window that said, "Open. Come in if you're hungry." She said she had gone in because she was curious and stayed because the soup was the best thing she had eaten since her grandmother died. "What kind of soup?" she asked. Celestine described it. She knew exactly what soup it was. She made it the next Tuesday and gave Celestine a bowl and watched her face and understood, from Celestine's expression, that she had gotten it right. The preservation grant came through in April. Not the full amount she had applied for, but enough, combined with her savings and a small business loan that took 3 applications and 2 months to secure, to complete the electrical upgrade, replace the roof, restore the kitchen to full operational capacity, and repair the facade of the building, which had needed repointing and new windows since before she was born. She did not restore the paneling in front of the mural. That section of kitchen wall was documented, catalogued, and left exactly as it was. The pine boards removed and stored, the plaster paintings exposed, a custom glass panel installed to protect the surface from kitchen moisture while keeping it visible. The installation had required 4 consultations with the preservation office and had been worth every one of them. She also cut a pass-through window in the kitchen partition, a design decision that Barrows had initially questioned and that she had insisted on, a rectangular opening at eye level that allowed the dining room to see directly into the kitchen, and specifically to see the mural wall. Dr. Ferrara had written a small descriptive card explaining the painting's history and origin that she planned to place on every table. In June, exactly when the original lease expired, she signed a new one. 15 years. The landlord, a retired contractor named Hendricks who had known her father, offered her a below-market rate without being asked, saying he had watched her father build that place from nothing for 20 years, and he wasn't going to be the one to end it. She thanked him and meant it completely. She named the restaurant after the flower in the murals. She had thought carefully about whether to keep the name Sal's. She had almost kept it. There was something right about the continuity, about the name that had survived 3 owners and 7 decades. But she had finally decided that keeping it would be a way of not deciding, which was different from choosing continuity honestly. Choosing continuity honestly meant understanding what you were carrying and why, not just leaving the old sign up because replacing it required a decision. The flower, painted throughout the murals with such precise and loving detail, had been identified by Dr. Ferrara's colleague as a variety of chicory, a plant common in Italian immigrant kitchen gardens of the early 20th century, planted for cooking and for medicine, its blue flowers appearing in the margins of the painted scenes like a repeated declaration of something essential and ordinary and good. She named the restaurant Iacoria. Reuben, when she told him, was quiet for a moment. Then he said her father would have called it a pretentious name for a neighborhood restaurant, and then admitted privately that he loved it. "You knew him well," she said. "I ate his food for 20 years, Reuben said. "That's about as well as you can know a person." The restaurant reopened on a Thursday in October, 13 months after her father died. She had kept his kitchen layout exactly. Every station where he had placed it, every workflow as he had designed it. She had learned in a year of cooking in that space that he had been right about all of it, that the kitchen moved the way a good kitchen should move, efficiently and without wasted motion, that the thought he had put into the arrangement was the kind of thought that didn't need improving, only continuing. She had also kept his soup on the menu. It was the only item she had not developed herself. She had written beside it in small type, "Daniel's recipe, unchanged." On opening night, when the first bowl went out, she watched from the kitchen window as a woman at table 4 took the first spoonful, paused, and looked up at her companion with an expression she recognized. The expression of someone who has tasted something that reaches back in time. Reuben came on the first Thursday. He sat at the corner table which had always been his table and which she had quietly reserved for him without saying so. He ordered 3 things and finished with the soup, and when she came out of the kitchen and sat across from him at the end of service, he looked at her for a long time before he spoke. "He would have eaten here every day," Reuben said. "I know," she said. "He would have told everyone he knew to come. He would have sat at this table and been insufferably proud of you and pretended he wasn't." She didn't say anything. "He was proud of you before this," Reuben said. "I want you to know that. It wasn't conditional. He was proud of you when you were studying law and when you stopped and when you were lost and when you found this. He talked about you the same way the whole time." He paused. "He just would have been particularly insufferable about this." She laughed, which was the right response and also the only one she had. She was 23 years old when the restaurant opened. She was not going to be a lawyer. She had made peace with this in the way you make peace with the things you choose deliberately. Not without loss, not without the occasional moment of wondering what the other life would have looked like, but without regret in any form that mattered. She had a mural on her kitchen wall that had survived since 1931. She had a soup recipe that had survived longer than that. Her father had learned it from his mother, who had learned it from hers, carried forward through decades in the specific way that food carries things, in the body, in the hands, in the memory of a particular smell that reaches you before thought does. She had a restaurant that had been 3 things before it was hers, and she thought of all 3 of them as part of what it was now. The hardware store and Sal's diner and her father's 21 years. All of it still present in the walls and the floors and the kitchen that moved the way it moved because Daniel had thought carefully about how work should move through a space. On the first anniversary of the reopening, she went into the kitchen after the last table had left and the staff had gone home and stood in front of the mural wall alone. The chicory flowers looked back at her from across 90 years, painted by a man or woman whose name she now knew, who had stood in this same building in 1931 during the worst economic collapse in American history, and had painted a kitchen full of food and people eating and children on counters and a garden visible through a window, which she had come to understand as an act of extraordinary stubbornness, a refusal, in the face of everything, to stop imagining abundance. Her father had covered that painting to protect it. He had left it for her to find. He had trusted her completely to know what to do. She had. She turned off the kitchen light and walked through the quiet dining room and stood for a moment on Maple Street in the cool October air. Above the door, the new sign caught the light from the street lamp. A single word, and below it, small, a painted chicory flower, blue, precise, exactly as it appeared on the wall inside. She locked the door. She had a reservation list for the following day. She had a delivery coming at 7 in the morning. She had a soup that had been her father's and was now hers and would belong, in time, to whoever learned it from her. That is how these things work. Not through documents or deeds or legal transfers, though those matter too. Through kitchens and recipes and the particular smell of old wood and olive oil. Through the decision to cover something carefully instead of destroying it. Through a letter that says, "I trust you to know what it's worth," and means it. She had been 22 years old with a plan that meant nothing and a father who noticed things without being told. She was 23 now, standing on Maple Street outside a restaurant with a mural on its kitchen wall that had been waiting 90 years for someone to uncover it. She was exactly where she was supposed to be. And she had known it, she realized, from the moment she walked through the door and the smell of the place reached her before anything else. Before sight, before thought, before any of the practical questions that would follow, before all of it, just the smell. And underneath the smell, faint but certain, something that felt like recognition, like a door opening that had always been there, in a wall she had simply never thought to look behind.